Derek Foster prided himself on tradition. Born and raised in a small southern town, he had grown up in a family that emphasized hard work, legacy, and old-fashioned values. He considered himself a respectable man, with an orderly life, a good job, and a beautiful wife, Marissa. She was a warm, intelligent woman who had always seemed almost too good for him. Together, they had 3 children, all of whom he raised with a strong belief in family loyalty. But under Derek's seemingly content surface lay a buried prejudice, an idea that the world was meant to run a certain way, a way that didn't involve people of different races, especially not people in positions of power. So when Marissa's boss, Jamal Lawson, a powerful and successful billionaire, bought out the company where Derek worked, he could feel his frustration building. It was one thing for his wife to work under Jamal's leadership, but another for Derek's own job to now be tied to Lawson's reputation and vision. He couldn't shake the feeling that his world was slipping out of his control, a sensation that was only exacerbated when his colleagues began singing Jamal's praises at every opportunity. Derek tried to avoid company events that Jamal attended, preferring to stay in his safe corner, refusing to see the boss as anything but a threat to his own place in life. On a chilly evening in late autumn, Derek had just returned from work, still fuming about the new company policies that Jamal had implemented, which required mandatory diversity training. When he entered the living room, he found Marissa seated on the sofa, going through her own work emails. He let out a frustrated sigh as he hung up his coat, hoping she would sense his irritation. Marissa glanced up and smiled. "Rough day, hon?" He shrugged, sinking into the armchair across from her. "Same old. More meetings about Jamal's new diversity initiatives. I'm telling you, it's getting out of hand." Marissa gave him a patient look. "You know, Jamal's changes are actually good for the company. And the employees. Diversity isn't a bad thing." Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Easy for you to say. You practically worship the guy. Not everyone sees him the way you do." Marissa's smile faded, and her eyes took on a steely glint. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she simply sighed, looking away. She seemed troubled, but Derek didn't dwell on it, assuming she was simply worn out. Their conversations had grown more tense over the past year, and he figured it was just one of the many small disagreements that had slowly come to define their marriage. The next few weeks went by with the same uneasy rhythm. Jamal's name came up often, both in Derek's workplace and at home. The tension in his household was mounting, and his irritation with Jamal only seemed to increase every time Marissa mentioned her boss with a hint of admiration. One Friday, at a company outing that Derek had begrudgingly attended, his patience finally broke. When someone mentioned how Jamal had single-handedly boosted profits, Derek sneered and made a crude comment about how power like that shouldn't be held by someone who'd never grown up in the right world. Several colleagues had heard him, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Derek could see his boss's warning glare, but he ignored it, too angry to care. But as he turned to leave, he heard Jamal's voice from behind him, calm and steady. "Derek, a word?" The small group parted to let Jamal through, and Derek felt a spike of irritation at the sight of his boss's confident stride. Jamal was composed, his dark eyes fixed on Derek's with an unreadable expression. Reluctantly, Derek followed Jamal away from the group, dreading the reprimand that was sure to follow. But to his surprise, Jamal said nothing about the incident. Instead, he pulled a chair up across from Derek, his tone unexpectedly calm. "I know you don't like me, Derek," Jamal began, "and that's fine. But I want you to know that I'm not here to take anything from you. I respect the people who work for me, and I expect that respect in return." Derek felt a flash of guilt but quickly pushed it down. He wanted to respond with something dismissive, but Jamal's steady gaze stopped him. Instead, he muttered something about not having an issue with him personally, though he knew it was a lie. Jamal didn't seem convinced but nodded anyway, clearly done with the conversation. That night, as Derek drove home, his frustration boiled over again, spilling into his thoughts. Why should he have to endure these changes, all because of one man's vision? And worse, why did Marissa seem to be so taken by Jamal, agreeing with every decision he made as though he was some kind of visionary? A few days later, Derek's routine was shaken in an unexpected way. His youngest child, Sarah, came home with a school project, a family tree assignment that required a DNA test for extra points. Amused, Derek agreed to participate, laughing at the idea of his genealogy being interesting in any way. Marissa also agreed, and they all took swabs of their DNA for the assignment. Weeks went by, and Derek had nearly forgotten about the test until one evening, he noticed Marissa on the phone, her voice unusually strained. She seemed anxious, and when she finally hung up, she avoided his gaze. "Something wrong?" he asked, feeling a pang of concern. She hesitated before looking up, her expression conflicted. "The DNA test results, they came in early," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about them?" he asked, mildly curious. Marissa looked away, biting her lip. "They're, well, surprising." Derek frowned, unsure of what she meant, but he didn't press her further. The next day, he took it upon himself to call the lab directly, requesting a copy of the results. His curiosity had gotten the better of him. And when the results arrived in his inbox later that day, he could feel his heartbeat quickening. A strange mixture of excitement and trepidation filled him as he opened the file. His eyes scanned the document, his brain struggling to comprehend the numbers and scientific terms. But as he reached the end, something in him snapped. He read and reread the words, his hands shaking, his chest tightening with disbelief. The DNA results didn't match. The children he had raised, the children he had seen grow, were not his own. The report suggested a different lineage entirely. His world began to tilt, and a cold realization washed over him as a name surfaced in his mind, a name he had despised for as long as he could remember. Jamal Lawson. Derek's mind raced as he stared at the screen, unable to believe the DNA results. The man he had resented, the one who had taken over both his work and, apparently, his family, now seemed intertwined in his life in ways he couldn't bear to acknowledge. He clenched his fists, feeling anger bubbling up inside him, but underneath that anger was a sickening realization: this wasn't just a bad dream. His children, the children he had loved and raised, were biologically Jamal's. He felt a strange sensation of betrayal flooding through him, a nauseating cocktail of rage and disbelief that made him want to throw his laptop across the room. He didn't know what to think or feel. The foundations of his life, his identity as a husband and father, were cracking beneath him. He had spent years upholding the illusion of control and authority in his family, but now that illusion was shattered, the shards cutting deep. Marissa entered the room, her face pale, her expression filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. She must have known he had seen the results. The tension between them was thick, almost tangible, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Explain this," he demanded, holding up the printed DNA report. His voice was cold, hard. He could barely recognize himself. Marissa swallowed, looking down, unable to meet his gaze. "Derek. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Didn't mean for what, Marissa?" His voice rose, louder than he intended. He could feel the beginnings of a headache, a dull throb that pulsed in time with his pounding heart. "You had a choice. You knew exactly what you were doing." Her voice was barely a whisper. "It just happened. It was complicated." "Oh, complicated, was it?" he spat, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "How could you let this happen? How could you betray me like this? And with him of all people?" Marissa's eyes flashed, and for the first time, her face hardened. "Jamal is not the enemy here, Derek. He's been a friend, and yes, I made mistakes, but it's not what you think." "Oh, really?" Derek let out a bitter laugh. "Enlighten me, then." How could it possibly not be what I think? The children's footsteps sounded in the hall, and both of them paused, a heavy silence falling over the room. Marissa looked at Derek, her eyes pleading for some level of discretion. Reluctantly, Derek held his tongue, though every fiber of his being wanted to keep pressing her until she admitted the truth in front of everyone. But he knew this wasn't the place or time. As their children came in, they greeted their parents with oblivious smiles, carrying on as if nothing had happened. They were innocent in all of this, unaware of the turmoil that had just torn through their family. Derek felt a pang of something close to guilt. They didn't deserve this, any of it. That night, Derek barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, images of Marissa and Jamal surfaced, unbidden, leaving him filled with an ugly jealousy he couldn't shake. He kept thinking of all the little moments he'd spent with his children, the first steps, the first words, the fatherly pride he'd felt. It had all felt so real. But now, in the wake of this discovery, it felt like a lie, a betrayal that cut deeper than anything he could have imagined. The next morning, he went to work in a daze, his mind still reeling. He knew he couldn't just let this go. He had to confront Jamal. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it felt like an assault on everything he held dear, everything he'd worked to build. And as he drove to the office, his mind churned with thoughts of how he'd confront his boss. By the time he arrived, he could feel his anger simmering just below the surface. He spotted Jamal in the conference room, casually sipping coffee and going over some documents. Derek's blood boiled as he watched him, the audacity of it all nearly sending him over the edge. Without waiting another moment, he stormed into the room, his footsteps heavy. Jamal looked up, surprised, his calm demeanor barely faltering. Derek didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk," Derek said through gritted teeth, his voice low and menacing. Jamal nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Sure, Derek. What's on your mind?" "What's on my mind?" Derek's voice was barely controlled, his hands clenching into fists as he fought the urge to lash out. "What's on my mind, Jamal, is that I know the truth. I know what you've been doing with my wife." Jamal's expression flickered, a hint of confusion crossing his face. But Derek didn't give him a chance to respond. He slammed the DNA report onto the table, his hand shaking as he pointed to the document. "Explain this," he demanded. "Explain why, after all these years, I find out that my kids aren't even mine. Explain why they share your DNA." Jamal's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the report, his face unreadable. There was a long silence as he processed what Derek had just said, and Derek felt a surge of satisfaction at the look of shock on his boss's face. Finally, Jamal sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm sorry, Derek," he said quietly, his tone calm but filled with regret. "I had no idea you found out this way. This isn't how I wanted you to know." "So you admit it?" Derek's voice rose, his fists clenched. "You admit you've been, what, sneaking around behind my back all these years?" Jamal's eyes softened slightly, and he shook his head. "It's more complicated than that, Derek. You don't know the whole story." "I don't need to know the whole story." Derek nearly shouted, his anger boiling over. "You had an affair with my wife, fathered my children, and now you have the nerve to sit here and act like this is all just some misunderstanding." "Derek, please," Jamal said, holding up a hand. "This isn't what you think." "Oh, it isn't?" Derek laughed bitterly. "Well, enlighten me. I'd love to hear how this is somehow not what it looks like." Jamal leaned forward, his face serious. "I cared about Marissa, yes, but this isn't something that happened behind your back." "Marissa. Marissa came to me because she needed someone to be there for her in ways you weren't willing to be." Derek's jaw clenched, his rage twisting into something darker as he tried to process what Jamal was saying. It felt like a slap in the face, a confirmation of everything he had feared. "I was there for her," he spat, his voice shaking. You had no right to step in. She was my wife, not yours. Jamal looked at him, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I may not have had the right, Derek, but I did what I thought was best for her, and for your family. Derek sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. Jamal's words echoed in his mind, each one hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had expected an apology, a desperate plea for forgiveness, or at least some sign of remorse from Jamal. Instead, he got something much worse, an admission that Jamal believed he had done what was best for his family. The arrogance, the audacity, it was infuriating. Unable to go back into the office or face his colleagues, Derek drove around aimlessly, hoping the drive would help him clear his mind. He wanted answers, explanations, anything that would make sense of the betrayal he was struggling to comprehend. He pulled over at a quiet park, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. How had he been so blind? So oblivious? His world had been pulled out from under him, and now he had to piece together the broken fragments of his life, unsure of where to even begin. The sound of his phone buzzing interrupted his thoughts. It was Marissa. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the answer button. Part of him wanted to ignore her call, to shut her out and never speak to her again. But another part of him, a part that remembered the good times, the years they had spent building a life together, made him answer. Derek? Marissa's voice was soft, tentative, as if she wasn't sure he'd actually pick up. He didn't reply, waiting for her to speak, to say anything that might explain what had happened. Can we talk? She asked after a long pause, her voice trembling slightly. Talk? He repeated, his voice hollow. I think we're past the point of talking, Marissa. She took a shaky breath. I know, but please, I need you to hear me out. I can't explain everything over the phone. Can you come home? Derek clenched his jaw, torn between anger and a lingering sense of obligation. Against his better judgment, he finally muttered, Fine. I'll be there soon. The drive home felt longer than usual, every second filled with dread and anticipation. By the time he pulled into the driveway, he could see Marissa standing by the window, watching for him. She looked fragile, a shadow of the confident woman he had once known. As he stepped inside, the silence between them felt heavy, suffocating. They stood in the hallway, facing each other, neither of them speaking at first. Finally, Marissa broke the silence. I'm so sorry, Derek, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to hurt you. This isn't how I wanted things to be. Derek let out a bitter laugh. Is that supposed to make me feel better, Marissa? Because right now, nothing you say is going to change the fact that you betrayed me. Marissa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I know, she said softly. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to understand why things happened the way they did. Derek crossed his arms, his expression hard. Fine. I'm listening. Explain to me why you thought it was okay to destroy our family. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. You remember when I started working for Jamal's company? I was under so much pressure, constantly juggling work and the kids. You were always busy with your own career, and I felt alone. Jamal was there for me in a way that you weren't. So you're saying this is my fault? Derek's voice was cold, his words sharp. No, that's not what I'm saying, Marissa replied, shaking her head. I take responsibility for my choices, Derek. But I need you to understand that it wasn't just a fling. I felt supported by him in ways I didn't feel at home. Derek felt his anger intensify, but he forced himself to remain calm, to hear her out. And what about our kids? Did you ever think about how this would affect them? Marissa's eyes filled with guilt. Of course I did. They're my children, Derek. And I know I made a mistake, but they deserve to have both of us in their lives. No matter what's happened between us, they still need a father." He looked away, his heart pounding with conflicting emotions. The thought of abandoning his children was unbearable, yet the idea of staying in a family built on lies felt equally impossible. How could he ever look at them the same way, knowing they weren't his? Seeing his turmoil, Marissa reached out, her voice pleading. "Please, Derek. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but think about the kids. They love you, and they need you. Don't punish them for my mistakes." He took a step back, avoiding her touch. "I need some time to think, Marissa. Right now, I can't promise anything." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Marissa standing alone in the hallway. As he drove away, his mind was a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and confusion. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had torn apart everything they had built together. But as much as he wanted to hate her, a small part of him couldn't ignore the years they had spent together, the family they had created, even if it wasn't entirely his. For the next few days, Derek avoided Marissa as much as possible, spending his nights at a friend's house while he tried to make sense of his emotions. He could barely sleep, his mind constantly returning to the DNA results and Marissa's confession. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, but at the same time, he couldn't bear the thought of losing his children. On the third day, he received an unexpected call from Jamal. He almost ignored it, but something compelled him to answer. "Derek," Jamal's voice was calm, though Derek could detect a hint of nervousness. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me right now, but I think we need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Derek replied coldly. "Please, just give me a chance to explain," Jamal said, his tone sincere. "I know this situation is complicated, and I understand if you hate me. But I care about Marissa and the kids, and I want what's best for them, and for you." Derek took a deep breath, weighing his options. As much as he wanted to hang up, he knew he needed answers. He agreed to meet Jamal later that evening, if only to confront him one last time. They met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Jamal was already seated, looking unusually somber as Derek approached. For a moment, they sat in silence, the tension between them almost palpable. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Jamal began, his gaze steady. "I never wanted to hurt you, Derek. I know that might not mean much to you, but it's the truth." Derek folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "Why did you do it, Jamal? Why did you go after my family?" Jamal sighed, looking away. "It wasn't planned, Derek. It just happened. Marissa and I connected on a level that I never expected. But I don't expect you to understand, or to forgive me. I just want you to know that I care deeply for Marissa, and for the kids. They mean the world to me." Derek's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger passing over his face. "They're not your family, Jamal. No matter what happened between you and Marissa, they're still my kids." Jamal nodded, his expression respectful. "I know, and I'm not trying to take that away from you. I only want to be a part of their lives if that's what you and Marissa want. I'm not here to replace you, Derek. I would never do that." Derek felt a strange mixture of relief and resentment at Jamal's words. He didn't know if he could ever truly forgive Jamal, but a part of him respected the man's honesty. As he left the cafe, Derek felt a glimmer of clarity. He still had a long road ahead of him, filled with difficult choices, but for the first time, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to rebuild his life and protect his family, no matter how fractured it was. The days stretched on in a haze for Derek. He was caught between his own resentment and a fierce desire to protect his children from the fallout. He had barely spoken to Marissa since their confrontation, and every time he saw her, he felt the sting of betrayal anew. Each glance at his children, however, brought him back to the bittersweet truth that they were still his, at least in every way that mattered beyond biology. But the feeling of loss loomed over him, like a wound that wouldn't heal, reminding him every day of what he thought he had. One evening, he was watching TV when he heard soft footsteps approach. Marissa stood at the doorway, her face weary. She looked hesitant, as though one wrong word might set him off. Without looking up, Derek gestured for her to speak. "Derek. I've been talking with Jamal. He says he's willing to help however he can. He wants to keep the peace, for the kids' sake." Derek felt his temper flare at the mention of Jamal. He wants to help. This whole mess is because of him, Marissa. Marissa took a breath, visibly trying to stay calm. "I know you're angry. I am, too, in a way. This isn't what I wanted either." He turned to face her, his gaze icy. "What did you think would happen, Marissa? That I'd find out and just accept it?" She flinched but held her ground. "I don't expect you to accept it. But we have to think about the kids, Derek. They're innocent in all this. If we start tearing each other apart, they're the ones who will suffer most." Derek bit back a retort, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew she was right, but it didn't make it easier. He had been so focused on his own pain that he hadn't stopped to think about how his anger might affect the children. "What do you want me to do, Marissa?" he asked, his tone weary. "I want us to try to keep things civil." "At least for now," she replied softly. "If we can't be a family anymore, the least we can do is show them stability." Derek took a deep breath, considering her words. He didn't know if he could manage civility, especially if it meant seeing Jamal around more often. But the thought of his children caught in the middle of their conflict was too much to bear. "Fine," he said, his voice resigned. "For the kids' sake, I'll try." They settled into an uneasy truce over the next few weeks, each doing their best to shield the children from their issues. But tension simmered beneath the surface, an unspoken bitterness that neither of them could fully ignore. Whenever Derek saw Marissa on the phone, he couldn't shake the suspicion that she was talking to Jamal. It ate away at him, fueling his resentment. The man wasn't just a ghost in his marriage, he was a constant presence, an intruder he couldn't escape. One weekend, Derek took the children to a nearby park to clear his mind. He watched as they laughed and played, his heart twisting with a mixture of love and sadness. They were his whole world, the only thing that had kept him grounded through everything. Yet every smile, every laugh reminded him of the lie that had been hiding beneath the surface for so long. As he sat there lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Derek, it's Jamal. We need to talk. Please meet me. I think it's time to put everything on the table." Derek's pulse quickened with anger. How dare Jamal contact him directly? But after a moment, he realized that maybe this was an opportunity to confront Jamal once and for all, to finally say what had been building inside him. He glanced at the kids and decided they'd be fine playing for a while. Derek replied to Jamal's message with a curt "where," and within minutes, he had the location, a small cafe just a few blocks away. Arriving at the cafe, Derek found Jamal already seated, looking more composed than Derek could bear. He took a seat across from Jamal, his expression a mix of anger and impatience. "Why did you call me here?" Derek demanded. Jamal met his gaze, his tone calm and respectful. "I wanted to talk, man to man. I know this situation is complicated. But Marissa and the kids are my priority, and I know they're yours, too." Derek scoffed. "Your priority? You mean the family you've been trying to steal from me?" Jamal shook his head. "Derek, I'm not here to take your family. I'm here because I care about Marissa and the kids, and I want to make sure they're happy and safe. This isn't a competition." "Oh, so you're just a saint in all this, right?" Derek's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You swooped in, played the hero, and now you're the noble protector." Jamal sighed, looking uncomfortable. I'm not trying to be anything, Derek. I know I messed up by getting involved with Marissa, but we can't undo the past. We can only decide how we're going to move forward. Derek clenched his jaw, feeling a surge of frustration. You think I can just move on from this? You think I can pretend everything is fine? No, I don't expect that, Jamal replied calmly. But I'm here to offer you something that might help us both. Derek's curiosity was piqued, though he hated to admit it. What are you talking about? Jamal took a deep breath. I've been thinking about the kids' future. Given the situation, it's only fair that I provide financial support. College, extracurriculars, anything they might need down the road. I want to make sure they're taken care of, no matter what happens between you and Marissa. Derek stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and outrage on his face. You think money is going to fix this? You think that throwing cash at the situation will somehow make up for everything you've done? Jamal held up a hand. It's not about fixing things, Derek. It's about ensuring the kids don't suffer because of our mistakes. They didn't ask for any of this, and they shouldn't have to bear the consequences. Derek's anger flared again, but he couldn't deny the truth in Jamal's words. The kids didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. And while the thought of accepting help from Jamal made his stomach turn, he knew that it might be in his children's best interest. Fine, Derek muttered, his voice tight. But don't think this means I forgive you. And don't think this gives you any more rights to them. Jamal nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. I understand. This is about the kids, nothing else. They sat in tense silence for a few moments before Derek finally stood up, eager to leave before his temper got the better of him. He didn't trust himself to stay calm around Jamal any longer than necessary. He turned to leave, not sparing Jamal another glance as he walked out. As he headed back to the park, Derek's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He hated the idea of accepting anything from Jamal, but he knew that he had to put his children's needs first. This wasn't about his pride, it was about ensuring that his kids had the best possible future, regardless of the mistakes that had been made. When he returned to the park, he saw his children playing, blissfully unaware of the turmoil their parents were facing. They ran to him, their faces alight with joy, and he scooped them up, his heart aching with love and pain. Watching them laugh and play, Derek knew he had a choice to make. He could either let his anger consume him, or he could find a way to rebuild his life around the pieces that remained. It wouldn't be easy, but for the sake of his children, he knew he had to try. As he held them close, he felt a newfound sense of resolve. He would protect his family, no matter what it took. And while he couldn't change the past, he would do everything in his power to shape a better future for the people he loved. Welcome to Story Hub, dedicated to exposing, understanding, and discussing stories. Here we dive deep into real-life experiences. By sharing these stories, we hope to create awareness, inspire change, and encourage open dialogue. If you're passionate about building a fairer world, please join us, like, comment, and subscribe to support the community and keep up with new stories each day. Derek was exhausted. Each day felt like a test of his willpower as he grappled with the weight of betrayal and the responsibility he felt toward his children. The strange co-parenting dynamic he'd entered with Marissa and, indirectly, Jamal was awkward and strained, yet for the sake of his kids, he held it together. Each interaction with Marissa seemed like a tense negotiation, and he couldn't stop the resentment from creeping back every time he saw her face. One evening, Derek was sitting alone in his apartment, the silence weighing heavily on him. He found himself scrolling through photos on his phone, pictures of his family from happier times. There were birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, and candid moments that brought back memories of a simpler time. He felt a pang of sadness, realizing that those memories were forever tainted by the truth he now knew. These weren't just his children, they were also a reminder of Marissa's infidelity. But as he looked closer, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. The kids' smiles, the way they looked at him with complete trust and love, none of that had changed. To them, he was still their father, the man they counted on. He felt a new determination rising within him. Whatever had happened with Marissa and Jamal, he couldn't let it cloud his relationship with his children. They were his, regardless of biology, and he needed to be the father they deserved. That weekend, he decided to do something special for them. He picked them up early Saturday morning, surprising them with plans for a day trip to an amusement park outside the city. The kids were thrilled, their excitement contagious as they chattered about the rides they wanted to go on and the games they hoped to play. It was the first time in weeks that Derek felt a genuine sense of happiness, free from the burden of his troubles. As they navigated the park, laughter filled the air. They went on every ride they could, Derek relishing the sound of his children's laughter. The day was perfect, a much-needed escape from reality. Toward the end of the day, they sat down for a quick meal. His daughter, Emma, looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, will you always be with us?" she asked, her voice filled with childlike curiosity. The question took Derek by surprise, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He looked at his daughter, seeing the trust in her gaze, and he felt a wave of love wash over him. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, smiling as he gently squeezed her hand. "I'll always be here for you and your brother. No matter what." His son, Jacob, grinned and gave him a high five, seemingly reassured. But Derek could see a hint of worry in his daughter's eyes, as though she sensed the tension that had clouded their lives lately. He pulled her into a hug, silently promising himself that he would do everything in his power to keep his family together, even if it meant navigating an uncomfortable relationship with Marissa and Jamal. When he dropped the kids off at Marissa's that evening, she met him at the door, looking more composed than he had seen her in weeks. "Thank you for taking them out," she said quietly. "They haven't stopped talking about it since they got back." Derek nodded, not meeting her gaze. He didn't want to engage in small talk, not after the day he'd had with the kids. But Marissa's expression softened, and she took a deep breath. "Derek, I know you're still angry. I don't expect you to forgive me. But we need to find a way to move forward, for the kids' sake." He met her eyes, the tension between them palpable. "I know that, Marissa. But it's not as easy as you make it sound." She sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I know. And I know I don't deserve your kindness. But if there's any part of you that can tolerate me, I want to make this work." Derek didn't reply, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He wanted to protect his children, but he wasn't sure he could handle the charade of civility with Marissa. As the weeks passed, the uneasy peace held. Derek saw the kids every weekend, doing his best to keep things as normal as possible. He noticed how they seemed to relax when he was around, their joy untainted by the tension that hung over their parents' interactions. One evening, Derek received an unexpected call from his mother. She lived in another state and had been distant ever since Marissa's infidelity came to light. Derek knew she was furious with Marissa, and he didn't blame her, but he wished she would try to support him instead of adding to his anger. "Derek, I've been thinking," his mother began, her voice filled with conviction. "You should come stay with me for a while. Bring the kids, even. A change of scenery might do you all some good." Derek considered it, tempted by the idea of getting away from everything for a while. But he knew that uprooting the kids, especially with school in session, wasn't an option. Still, he couldn't ignore the pull of her offer. "Maybe," he replied, non-committal. "But I don't think it's the right time, Mom. The kids need stability right now." She sighed, clearly disappointed. "Just think about it, Derek. You deserve a fresh start." The call left him feeling conflicted. Part of him wanted to escape, to leave behind the pain and betrayal and start over. But he knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. His children needed him, and he couldn't abandon them, no matter how tempting the prospect of a new beginning seemed. The next day, He was back at the office, trying to focus on his work when a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Jamal standing in the doorway, a hesitant expression on his face. "Derek, can we talk?" Derek bristled, his hands clenching at his sides. He didn't want to see Jamal, let alone speak to him, but he knew avoiding him forever wasn't realistic. "Fine," he replied tersely, motioning for Jamal to sit. Jamal took a seat, his demeanor unusually subdued. He looked at Derek with a sincerity that was almost disarming. "I want you to know that I'm here to support you and Marissa in whatever way I can," Jamal began. "I know this situation isn't ideal, but I don't want to make things harder than they already are." Derek's jaw tightened. "This situation isn't ideal because you crossed a line, Jamal. Don't pretend you're the hero here." Jamal nodded, his expression resigned. "I'm not trying to be a hero, Derek. I know I made mistakes. But the kids, they mean a lot to me, too. I want them to grow up happy and secure, and that means we have to put our differences aside." Derek's anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew Jamal was right, even if the truth was hard to swallow. His children deserved better than a broken family torn apart by resentment and bitterness. "Fine," he replied, his tone begrudging. "But don't expect me to be your friend, Jamal. I'm doing this for my kids, not for you." Jamal nodded, a hint of relief in his eyes. "Understood. And thank you, Derek. I know this isn't easy for you." As Jamal left, Derek felt a strange sense of relief mixed with resentment. He still didn't like the man, but he couldn't deny that his children were better off if they all worked together. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could navigate this situation without tearing each other apart. That weekend, when he picked up his kids, they looked up at him with their usual wide-eyed wonder and trust. He hugged them tightly, vowing to himself that no matter what, he would be the father they needed. The days following Derek's reluctant truce with Jamal passed in a blur. He tried his best to settle into this strange, co-parenting arrangement, but his emotions were like a storm, never truly calm. He was still grappling with the sense of betrayal that lingered around him like a shadow. But for his children, he held himself together, each day trying to offer them the stability and happiness they deserved. One evening, as he was preparing dinner for the kids, his phone buzzed with a text from Marissa. "We need to talk. I'll drop by tomorrow after work." Derek stared at the message, feeling a rush of irritation. They'd been communicating mostly through brief texts, and he preferred it that way. Face-to-face conversations were a minefield of raw emotions he wasn't ready to navigate. But if Marissa had something important to say, he figured it couldn't be avoided. He responded with a curt, "Fine." The next evening, Marissa arrived at his apartment, looking nervous. Derek gestured for her to come in, silently closing the door behind her. She took a seat, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "I wanted to talk about the kids," Marissa began, her voice quiet but firm. "They've been asking a lot of questions, Derek. About why things are different. They're confused, and it's affecting them." Derek clenched his jaw. He knew the kids were struggling with the changes, but he'd done his best to shield them from the worst of it. Still, they were perceptive, picking up on the tension even if they didn't fully understand it. "They're strong, Marissa. They'll be okay," he replied, his tone clipped. "But they're not okay, Derek," she countered, her eyes pleading. "Emma has been having trouble sleeping. She's scared to ask me what's wrong because she can sense something's off. Jacob keeps asking if you and I are still friends." Derek felt a pang of guilt at the thought of his children suffering because of the turmoil in his marriage. They were too young to understand what was happening, and he hated the idea of them feeling lost and uncertain. "What do you suggest, then?" he asked, a hint of resignation in his voice. Marissa hesitated, as though bracing herself. "Maybe, maybe we should consider family therapy. For the kids' sake. Just so they can talk to someone, and we can figure out how to make things easier for them. Derek's first instinct was to dismiss the idea. Therapy felt too raw, too invasive. But as he thought about his children, Emma's sleepless nights, Jacob's questions, he realized that they needed more than just parents who loved them. They needed reassurance and guidance that neither he nor Marissa could fully provide on their own. "Fine," he said finally. "But this is for the kids, not for us." Marissa nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you, Derek. I'll find someone who can help." The first therapy session was scheduled for the following week. Derek arrived at the therapist's office with the kids, feeling a mixture of skepticism and unease. He wasn't sure what to expect or how much he was willing to share. But he knew that he needed to put his children's well-being above his own discomfort. The therapist, Dr. Patel, was warm and approachable, putting the kids at ease right away. She had them draw pictures, play with toys, and share stories about their favorite memories with their parents. Derek was surprised by how much the children opened up, their worries spilling out in innocent, childlike words. When it was Derek's turn, he found himself struggling to articulate his feelings. He glanced at Marissa, who sat across from him, her expression guarded. The resentment bubbled beneath the surface, but he knew that lashing out would only hurt the kids more. As the weeks went by, Derek found himself loosening up in therapy, letting go of some of the bitterness he'd been holding on to. He began to see the sessions not as a way to fix his relationship with Marissa but as a way to help his children navigate the changes in their lives. And to his surprise, he found that the kids were responding well to the sessions, becoming more open and less anxious. But outside the therapy room, tensions remained high. One evening, after dropping the kids off with Marissa, Derek received a call from Jamal. "Derek, I've been thinking," Jamal began, his tone measured. "We've managed to keep things civil, and the kids seem to be adjusting. But I think there's more we can do to make this work." Derek was taken aback. He'd gotten used to Jamal's presence as an unwelcome but unavoidable reality, and he wasn't sure he wanted to hear whatever proposal Jamal had in mind. "What are you suggesting?" Derek asked, barely masking his irritation. "I'm suggesting that we try to find a way to work together. Maybe we can do things as a group, attend the kids' events together, show them that we're all here for them, even if things between us aren't perfect." Derek bit back a retort. The thought of spending any more time around Jamal than necessary made his skin crawl. But he knew that the kids were happiest when they saw both their parents involved and supportive. "I don't know," Derek replied cautiously. "I need time to think about it." The next week, Derek found himself at one of Emma's school events, an art showcase she'd been excited about for weeks. He watched with pride as she led him around the classroom, showing him her artwork and explaining the inspiration behind each piece. He was so absorbed in her enthusiasm that he didn't notice Marissa and Jamal enter the room until Emma pointed them out, her face lighting up with excitement. "Mommy." "Jamal," she called, running over to greet them. Derek's stomach twisted as he watched Emma hug them both, the scene reminding him of everything he'd lost. But he forced a smile, knowing that his daughter's happiness was more important than his pride. For the rest of the event, Derek found himself standing alongside Marissa and Jamal, an awkward but necessary coexistence. They made small talk for Emma's sake, carefully avoiding any mention of the issues between them. But Derek couldn't shake the feeling of resentment that simmered beneath his polite exterior. As the evening drew to a close, Derek felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was proud of his daughter and grateful to be part of her life. On the other, he felt a pang of jealousy every time he saw her interacting with Jamal. It was as though Jamal had taken something from him, something that he could never fully reclaim. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Derek found himself reflecting on the day's events. He realized that his anger toward Jamal was only hurting himself. It was like a poison, eating away at him from the inside, keeping him from fully being there for his children. He knew he needed to let go, to find a way to accept the reality of his situation. The next morning, he called Jamal. "About your idea," Derek began, his tone hesitant. "Maybe we can try it. For the kids' sake." Jamal sounded surprised but appreciative. "Thank you, Derek. I know this isn't easy, but I think it'll make a difference for Emma and Jacob." From that day forward, Derek, Marissa, and Jamal began working together, albeit reluctantly, to create a sense of normalcy for the children. They attended school events together, coordinated family outings, and did their best to present a united front. It wasn't always smooth. There were moments of tension and awkwardness, but over time, Derek found himself focusing less on his anger and more on his children's happiness. One evening, as he sat with Emma and Jacob, helping them with their homework, he realized that he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The resentment and bitterness were still there, but they no longer consumed him. He had found a way to be present for his children, to be the father they needed, even in the midst of his pain. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, Derek knew that he had taken an important step toward healing. He was no longer a prisoner of his anger. He was a father, determined to give his children the love and stability they deserved. Months had passed since Derek's initial discovery, and life had settled into an unexpected, but surprisingly manageable, routine. He'd continued working with Marissa and Jamal to make things easier for Emma and Jacob, who had become accustomed to this new arrangement. The therapy sessions had helped them adjust, and their smiles seemed a little brighter every day. Even Derek, despite everything, felt a growing sense of peace in the chaos. One crisp morning, Derek received a call from Marissa. She sounded anxious, her voice wavering. "Derek, there's something I need to tell you in person. Can you come by tonight?" His stomach twisted with worry, but he agreed, trying to brush aside the memories of past confrontations. After work, he drove to Marissa's house, parking in the familiar driveway. As he entered, he saw her standing by the kitchen island, her hands fidgeting with a cup of tea, her gaze distant. "Marissa, what's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the words. Finally, she looked up at him, her face lined with guilt and vulnerability. "Derek, I know I've hurt you, and I know this is probably the hardest thing I could ask of you. But the kids, they deserve to know the truth. They're starting to notice things, and it's only a matter of time before they start asking questions we can't avoid." Derek's heart pounded as he processed her words. The thought of telling Emma and Jacob the truth about their parentage was terrifying. He feared the impact it might have on their sense of identity, their trust in him, and their perception of family. "They're too young, Marissa," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "They don't need to know this yet. Not when they're still adjusting." Marissa shook her head, her expression resolute. "Derek, we both know it's better they hear it from us now than find out later. Imagine what it would do to them if they found out accidentally or, worse, from someone else." Derek couldn't deny the logic in her words, but it didn't make the decision any easier. He looked away, his mind racing with memories of their children's laughter and trust, of the family they had once been. After a long, tense silence, he finally nodded. "All right. But we'll do it together. And we'll make sure they understand that nothing changes, that I'm still their father, no matter what." The following weekend, Derek and Marissa sat Emma and Jacob down in the living room. The kids sensed the gravity of the moment, their innocent faces filled with curiosity and apprehension. Derek took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of the words he was about to say. "Emma, Jacob," he began, choosing his words carefully, "there's something your mom and I need to talk to you about. It's important, and we want you to know that we both love you very much." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide and trusting. Jacob, ever curious, leaned forward, his face filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You both know that families come in all shapes and forms, right?" Derek continued, glancing at Marissa for support. She nodded, reaching out to hold their children's hands. "There's something special about our family, too," Marissa said gently. "Your dad and I, we have had our challenges. But there's one thing we both agree on, that you are the most precious parts of our lives." Derek took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "What we're trying to tell you is that, while I'm your dad and will always be, you have another family connection that's important, too." Marissa gave Derek a reassuring look before turning back to the children. "Your mom's boss, Jamal," she said softly, "is also a part of our family in a special way." Emma and Jacob exchanged puzzled glances, their young minds processing the information. "He's a part of you both, too," Derek explained, his voice filled with love and determination. "It doesn't change anything about how much I love you, and it doesn't change who you are to me. You'll always be my kids, no matter what." For a moment, the room was silent, the children's faces a mixture of confusion and understanding. But as they looked up at Derek and Marissa, their expressions softened. Emma reached out to hold Derek's hand, her small fingers squeezing his tightly. "So, you're still our dad?" she asked, her voice filled with the innocent hope that only a child could have. Derek nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "I will always be your dad, Emma. Nothing will ever change that." Jacob looked up at him with a newfound sense of understanding, his young mind piecing together the puzzle of his family. "And we're still a family?" Marissa smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, Jacob. We're still a family. Just a little bigger and a little more special." As the days passed, Derek marveled at the resilience of his children. They took the news with an openness that filled him with hope. They still looked at him with the same love and trust, and he knew that, in their eyes, he was irreplaceable. Over time, Derek and Jamal developed a cautious respect for one another, each recognizing the other's role in the children's lives. They attended school events and family gatherings together, united by their shared love for Emma and Jacob. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but they had found a way to coexist for the sake of the family they both cherished. One evening, as Derek was tucking Emma and Jacob into bed, Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with wisdom beyond her years. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm glad we're a big family now. I like it this way." Derek smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He leaned down to kiss her forehead, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. "Me too, sweetheart," he replied softly. "Me too." As he left their room, Derek felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the journey had been painful, filled with betrayal and heartache, but it had also brought him closer to his children and helped him redefine what family truly meant. In the end, Derek had found a way to transform his pain into something beautiful. He had let go of the resentment and anger, choosing instead to focus on the love that had always been at the heart of his family. And as he closed the door to his children's room, he knew that, no matter what, they would always be his, now and forever.